In September 2018, a white police officer fatally shot a black man in Dallas, Texas. Allegations of institutional racism and police violence in the US had been rife for decades, but the circumstances of this case made it all the more shocking. The officer in question was not on duty at the time, and the victim was in his own home. This is what happens when mistakes cost lives. This is the murder of Botham Jean. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you like crime content and you like deep dives and you like consistency, then this is the channel for you, because crime and consistency is my thing. Wednesdays and Sundays, same time, every single week, I am here. If you haven't joined me for a live chat, why don't you? I'm there, have a bit of a natter with you. My community is amazing. Also, to everybody supporting me with my YouTube membership and my Patreon, thank you so much. I've got a lot more stuff happening on Patreon as well. A lot more Making Sense podcasts and lots of different things happening. So thank you. I appreciate you all. I'm going to be paying a lot more attention to those things, because without you guys helping me, I couldn't really make this content at all. So massive, massive props to you. Let's go back to 6th of September 2018. This is going to be one of those cases that if you haven't heard it before, you're going to have your mouth open throughout a great deal of it. If you have heard of it before, you may have opinions that differ with mine. If you've only kind of heard the very basic details, you may be really surprised by the content that I discussed today. And I'd be really interested to know your particular thoughts. Even at this point, let me know whether this is a case you really know well and you've got a very clear opinion on, or is this one that you know a little bit about and you're conflicted? Hopefully by the end of it, you won't feel conflicted anymore. So on the 6th of September 2018, Dallas police officer Amber Renee Geiger, she leaves work, it's 9:33 p.m. Now, Guyger at this point had been in the police force for 4 years, and she'd been assigned to the Southeast Patrol Division. When she clocks off from work, she had just finished a 15-hour shift. She had been assisting a SWAT team in a robbery standoff. It's a long shift. 15 hours is a long time. She'd worked nearly 6 hours overtime, so understandably she'd be tired. Geiger's police partner at that time was Martin Rivera. Now, what I will note about this couple, even though they were partners at work, they had been intimate partners as well. So they'd been romantically involved in the previous year. However, they allegedly ended that relationship because they apparently both knew that it was wrong. I presume when they say they knew it was wrong, they're talking both morally and also actually professionally, because Rivera was a married man. Now, that said, so they're suggesting that the relationship was over. That said, according to later testimony, the two were still exchanging texts that were personal, so they were talking about getting together later that evening. So like I said, allegedly it had ended, but there's still a very clear, close relationship happening at this moment in time that we're relating to now. Now, 5 minutes after Geiger leaves work, Rivera calls her. It's 9:38 p.m. And at this point, she's still speaking to him when she pulls into her apartment complex. She pulls in to her apartment complex at 9:46 p.m. And these apartments are a place that she's moved into a few months earlier. It's into Southside Flats, that's in Dallas. And she's been there a few months, but she's not been there for a very long time. It's really convenient, actually, that address, because it happens to be very near the police department headquarters. It's just 2 blocks away. Also, there was parking in a garage adjoining the complex, which meant that you got direct access into each floor of the apartment. So there's a real convenience there. Geiger lived on the 3rd floor in room 1378. Now, according to Geiger, she was also pleasantly surprised that evening because she managed to find a space right next to the access door. And that was handy for her because basically she had a lot of heavy police equipment. She had to carry that, including her police vest. So she's still dressed in uniform at this point, but she is off duty. However, she also wasn't wearing her body cam, and that should have been something that she was doing at that moment in time because that's within their regulations. Now, she remains in her pickup truck and basically continues to have this conversation with Rivera, and this is until shortly before 10 p.m. that evening. Now, it's fair to say at this point, obviously, there's a level of exhaustion, quite a lot of distraction. She's on the phone talking to this guy she's not in a relationship with, and obviously her intention is to just get into her apartment. Now, I'm going to tell you exactly what Geiger testifies later down the line. So this is what she says happens when she walks from her vehicle to her apartment. Basically, she says she arrived at the apartment, but instantly she notices there's something wrong. So her apartment door is very slightly ajar. It's just off the latch. But then she hears some really loud shuffling inside. We can absolutely imagine that if you're outside your apartment, the door's off the latch, you're hearing noise and movement inside, you are going to be very perturbed because arguably you're thinking, this is my apartment and somebody is clearly in my apartment. And that is going to send you into a level of chaotic thinking without a doubt. Personally, I'm going to state my case right now before I go any further. If I arrived at my apartment and the door was slightly ajar and I heard somebody moving around inside and there was a copper, I would back away, I would return to my vehicle and I would call my mates, 911. You know, the kind of stuff that you would imagine you'd do if you thought somebody was shuffling around in your apartment. But this isn't what she decides to do. She concludes that there is a threat inside. So she inserts her key fob into the lock and she uses her left arm, and apparently because she does that, she's able to open the door fully. Then she enters the apartment. Now there's no light on inside, but she continues to hear this moving around, and she's scared. Understandably, we can definitely give her that emotion. It must be terrifying if you think that you're in your apartment and there's somebody in there. My question is still going to be, why are you going in? You're a woman by yourself. I don't care if you're a police officer. If you have alternatives, if you have possibilities that mean that you don't need to be put at threat, if you can knock on a neighbour's door and ask for some help, if you can call the police, if you can do everything and anything but decide to place yourself in a position of risk, I just don't compute this action. I really don't. Because let's just put it into the context that actually there is somebody doing a home invasion and they've actually come armed and there's more than two of them. You don't know, do you? Because if you're going in without any knowledge of what's actually going to be in there before you, and you don't know whether they're armed, you don't know whether they're dangerous, they're going to potentially attack you, even if you manage to, shall we say, shoot one of them, you still might have to deal with others, and so on and so forth. There's like a million reasons why you would not enter an apartment and put yourself at risk, because you haven't got kids in there, you haven't got another family member in there, there's no one to protect in the environment. You don't need to be in there. You can always replace stuff, as my mother says. But she chooses to do that. And she believes that during that moment in time, she's scared to death. Again, odd emotion. If you are scared to death and have no reason to be in a situation, remove yourself from the situation, then you don't have to be scared to death. So it worries me, that description. So she basically uses the equipment that she was carrying to prop the door open so she can hold it open so she can then kind of peer around and look inside. Now, Geiger's apartment was just like others in the complex. It's one of those multi-purpose complexes that basically is for living, and every single apartment tends to be exactly the same, and it's a really open plan living experience, as modern day apartments tend to be. So the kitchen's on the right as you enter, and basically you can see straight ahead all the way through to the back. So Geiger says that she saw this silhouette figure standing in the back of her apartment. Now, bear in mind, she's some distance away, so she's near the doorway. And she said that at that point, she couldn't actually see the figure's hands. Now, at this point, she decides to pull a weapon, which is a 9mm service pistol. She says she shouted, "Let me see your hands, let me see your hands," and then claims that at this point, the figure walked towards her at a fast pace and apparently was aggressively shouting, "Hey, hey, hey." Now, according to Geiger, she thought that the intruder was going to kill her. And Geiger said later that she fully intended to kill him. And so she fired 2 shots. One of the rounds missed, hit the south wall, but the other bullet struck the man directly in the chest. He falls to the floor next to the couch. So she's now in a scenario where she was dealing with, as far as she was concerned, a potential home invasion, but she's acknowledged that she fully intended to kill whoever was in her home. Now, I do appreciate in different countries there are different laws. I do appreciate that people have a right to defend their property, whether I agree with that or otherwise, because like I said, stuff is stuff and it can be replaced. People can't be replaced. And even if somebody isn't the nicest person in the world, being shot because you've gone in to steal some items of furniture or TVs, it's not ideal you're doing it, but I don't think you should end up dead. Just a personal opinion. But arguably, that's the conscious decision that she'd made, that if somebody was in her apartment, she was perfectly willing to kill them. Like I said, I think that's an extreme reaction. Now, according to Geiger, this is at the point where she kind of starts to take things in. And the first thing she notices is that there's a kitchen area on her right. So that means that she suddenly realizes that she's actually in the wrong apartment. So this isn't number 1378 at all. This is apartment 1478. And that one is the apartment that's directly above hers. So somehow, in her distraction, she'd managed to park on the 4th floor, not the 3rd floor, and she hadn't shot this dangerous home invader. She'd shot 26-year-old Botham Jean in his own apartment. Now, obviously, as this registers, that she's basically shot a man who she has no reason to have shot because this isn't her home. What is she doing in it? At this point, when reality starts to dawn on her and the true horror of her actions begins to be realised, she calls 911. This is what she says. She's holding the phone in her right hand. Apparently, according to her, at this point, she performed chest compressions on Botham with her left hand. And then Geiger told the dispatcher that she was a police officer. At this point, she requests an officer assist. Now, during the 5-minute conversation, she told the dispatcher a total of 20 times that she believed she was in her apartment, that she'd shot a man because she believed he had broken in. Now, bear in mind, whilst I'm telling you all this, this is her testimony. I'm going to dissect this a little bit more down the line, but for now, this is what she's saying happened and how this played out piece by piece. So she tells this dispatcher numerous times that she believed this guy was in her apartment. She'd shot him because she believed that he had broken into her home. And during the call, she's actually heard saying, "Stay with me, bud," multiple times. And I fucked up. I'm going to lose my job. And at one point, she says this, hey bud, they're coming. Sorry, man. Oh my God, I'm done. I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry. Stay with me, bud. I thought it was my apartment. Like I said, just as an aside, I still could not be on board with this if it had been her apartment. Genuinely. There were other opportunities. She hadn't woken up in the middle of the night to find home invaders. She wasn't in a scenario where she had to make the active choices that she's made. Just going to put that out right now. Like I said, she chose to go into that apartment. So then 2 officers end up coming to the scene relatively quickly. And it's at this point that Geiger is instructed to move away. One of the officers then starts to perform CPR on Botham, and he is critically wounded. Now he's alive, but he's unconscious. They have body cam of this. So we see Geiger repeatedly saying that she'd shot him. She's not trying for a minute to deny the reality of what she's done, but obviously her explanation is, I got things wrong. I thought it was my apartment. She thought he was an intruder, but she's repeatedly saying and stating that she shot him. The paramedics, they arrive shortly after 10:08 p.m. And at this point, Botham's got no pulse. He's not breathing. And despite all these resuscitation attempts, and they really do try, he gets rushed to Baylor Medical Center and he dies. In fact, he never actually regained consciousness because she had shot him in an area where he genuinely could never have survived. Then we have a detective who arrives later on the scene. And at this point, this detective notices Geiger's keys in the apartment lock. So he obviously is kind of curious because he thinks, well, her keys are in the lock. I suppose he's thinking, well, it would add up if she believed that she'd actually managed to gain entry into her apartment using her keys and it worked. That would have tricked her into believing that actually potentially this was her apartment. But when he tried to use the fob to unlock the door, the lock blinked red. And that clearly is saying you can't enter here, it doesn't work properly. It's not green as it would be if she'd gained access into her own apartment. So he then locates Botham's fob, does the same, and of course the lock blinked green and opened. Now, as per official procedure, one of the things that they do there is they take a blood sample from Guyger. This is approximately 3 a.m. in the morning because obviously they want to check that she hadn't been under the influence of anything, and they do conclude, in fact, she had no drugs in her system, she had no alcohol in her system, and it's at this point that they have to launch an investigation, of course, because this man who was just in his own home, just living his life in a place that should be a sanctuary, because let's bear in mind the reality of what we're talking about right now. He was in his own apartment and some random person has walked in to his space and basically executed him. Because think about how it played out. His home, somebody stepped over his boundary, and then somebody purposefully and willfully killed him. Now, that investigation, they know, is going to come under a lot of criticism, and rightfully so, because when a police officer kills an innocent person, you immediately want to know how the hell has that happened. It makes every other person out there feel scared, because if it can happen to somebody who's just in their own home, doing nothing but living their life, then you can bet your bottom dollar it could happen to anybody. So they start this investigation. They want to be as transparent as possible. So the Dallas police actually hand the case over to the Texas Rangers because they want to make sure that from the outside looking in, it doesn't look like any funny business has occurred. Let's be honest. When authorities investigate themselves, a lot of the time, the authorities are like, oh, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. I'm not sure it was fine. I'm not sure it was fine because people died. We're saying we've looked at it, we've checked it. It was all fine. Everything. They did everything right. Pretty sure they didn't follow any of the actual specific guidance. That did happen, but what we've decided to do is to say that in spite of that, it's all fine and we should just close the book, move on. The problem with you is you don't want to move on. I don't want to move on. I want things to change. So this is what happens in a lot of those scenarios, isn't it? So when they start this investigation, and I can imagine the authorities are pretty disturbed by what they were finding out on the basis that you know that the worst case scenario is that somebody who is meant to protect you, somebody that you're meant to be able to rely on in your moment of need, could actually turn out to be essentially a perpetrator of a grotesque crime when they invaded somebody else's home and killed them. And you can imagine that they're thinking, my gosh, the tensions that this could create, and rightly so, is going to be something that they need to navigate very, very carefully. And it really is as bad, if not worse, than they could ever have imagined when they start looking at the cold, hard facts. Because it transpires that Botham Jean, this innocent man Guyger had killed, was as far from a home invader as one could be. He's firstly a really popular figure in his community, really popular in his local church, the Dallas West Church of Christ, man of real deep faith. He was known for lots of beautiful reasons, but he had this beautiful voice. He sang in the choir, and apparently he would take any opportunity to get up on stage and sing. He had a God-given talent, and he loved to share it. He was a member of the Good News singing group, and he travelled the world singing spiritual music. He also taught Bible study, and he was known genuinely as a character to be this lovely, generous, kind man. Botham Jean was born in St. Lucia. He was somebody who literally excelled in high school, really popular. He graduated from Harding University in Arkansas in 2016, and he was known to frequently lead worship and chapel services on campus. He was really engaged. He really felt that bringing the Lord into people's lives was enriching for the people that he met. It was something he was deeply committed to. And then later, after he graduated, he worked as an accountant for PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is a multinational audit and consulting firm with offices in Dallas. You know, can we get a more pro-social human than I'm describing right now? Can we get a better neighbour than Botham Jean? When you think about who you want around you, when you're living somewhere, you want this kind of human in your life. Because you know if you've got a problem, you're going to be able to knock on the door. You know if you're short of sugar, they're going to be handing it over. You know that in your times of crisis, they'll lend you an ear. Botham Jean is one of those spectacularly unusual humans who commits to others in as much as he can and brings into their lives as much light as possible. And even when he's at work, so when he's just doing his professional life, he was a really high achieving employee and he was on a partnership track. And this is a big company. This guy's special. But that all said, the most important point that I'll make is that first and foremost, beyond any of the things I've just described about this incredible human being, and believe me, he was incredible, he was a really, really much loved son to his parents, Bertram and Alison, and brother to his two siblings, Brant and Alyssa. In fact, a close friend of his, Alexis Stossel, stated this: people gravitated towards him. It didn't matter if you didn't know him personally or if you were just in the same room. You just felt welcomed by his presence. And she also said that Botham insisted that she actually referred to him as my black friend Botham. So I guess there was a real pride in who he was, a real pride. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it in a very positive way. He was self-accepting and he was accepting of everyone else's selves. And like I said, in our society, if the world was made of Botham Jeans, we would all be in a very good place, wouldn't we? We'd always have somewhere to go, someone to listen to us, someone to make us feel safe. Now, during questioning, because obviously there's a big process that they need to go through investigating this crime, Geiger maintains that when she parked in the garage, she had fully believed that she was on the 3rd floor. And she had, again, fully believed that Botham was a burglar and that she felt very threatened by this when he moved towards her. So her argument is, look, I killed him in self-defense. However, there are a few problems that we'll go through. So first of all, Guyger hadn't followed the correct police procedure. So first off, if you are faced with an unknown threat, there is a clear protocol. You're meant to take cover and you're meant to wait for backup, because that makes perfect sense. That's the logical reality. I don't need training anywhere to be told that if there might be a threat in an apartment, I don't need to go in. I ain't going in there. I'm going to go and call for backup and I'm going to let somebody else deal with it ideally, or at least feel safe when I try to deal with it. There are other options and she chose not to take them. Instead, she enters the apartment and she opens fire. Now, if she had followed the correct procedure, we can all agree Botham would never have been killed, and the reality is this story would never have been told. She'd also missed some very clear key differences while she was en route to the apartment. First of all, she didn't notice the garage roof line on the 4th floor was different to the roof line on the 3rd floor. She didn't notice the really distinctive red doormat directly outside Botham's front door. Geiger didn't even have a doormat. Now, I don't know about you. If I come home and there's a doormat outside my door, I'm going to be looking at my doormat and thinking, this is really weird. That's not my doormat. Why is there a doormat there? That's going to be question one. And it's going to do enough to make me think, is this my actual doorway? Because if so, I clearly have a Robin Hood type person just leaving presents for me. The reality is those things should click you in to reality. They should be bringing you into the present moment and making you question what is going on, what is distinct, what is different. But not only does she not notice that, she fails to notice the apartment number. So the apartment number was 1478, not 1378. So we're talking a different look from the garage. We're talking a doormat outside a door that doesn't normally have one, and we're talking about a completely different number of apartment. Come on. There are a lot of signs there. And that's problematic, because if you're saying self-defense, you better believe that you have a reasonable defense to argue that. And right now, I ain't seeing one. Now, following Botham's death, there were so many public demonstrations. You can look them up online, and I fully understand them, because the shooting was basically just one of a series of quite high-profile killings of unarmed black men and teens by white US police officers, and understandably that creates racial tension. I always come back to this position of we want to believe that the police are there to protect us. We don't want to believe that the colour of our skin could create a scenario where we're just going about our business and we end up dead because somebody has a belief system and bias about what we may be doing when actually we're just legally going about our business. And I do appreciate that some people will be listening now from the States and think, well, actually, some of the individuals who have been shot and killed, they were not people that would win awards for being Mr. and Mrs. Pro-Social. But understandably, there are often other choices that police officers can make. Police officers are not just armed with guns, and I think that the jump into shooting and shooting to kill should not necessarily be even on the list of what we intentionally do when we're dealing with a scenario, unless our life is absolutely under threat. And I appreciate that police officers have to go into quite difficult situations and challenging situations, and psychologically they need to be prepared to kill, and also they have a right to do that, at least in the States, etc., as long as they can evidence that it was basically their life or the person who they're there to apprehend. But the racial tensions, you understand, are huge. And right now we're talking about Botham Jean, a brilliant human being, murdered essentially in his own home. Now, after questioning, Geiger's initially released whilst the investigation continues, and people feel really angry because people feel that if this was just your common average Joe, there's no way that she'd be walking the streets. People are saying, listen, if somebody had walked into my home and killed me and they weren't a police officer, you would have them banged to rights. They would be in jail. There would be no question about this. But this doesn't seem to be the case at this point, so they allow her to be free. Obviously, she's not immediately charged, and again, that makes people think to themselves, hey, hang on a minute. Is this going to be one of those scenarios where somebody is just legally allowed to kill a black man in his own home and they're going to walk? So people are getting really upset and really riled, and I fully empathise with that. I'd feel exactly the same. So 72 hours after the shooting, this is whilst Guyger's on administrative leave, the Texas Rangers do go and arrest and charge her. And initially, they charge her with manslaughter. And I imagine that some of you might feel that that's appropriate. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But essentially, that does nothing to appease the local population and the wider population. So people are starting to get really upset that she's been charged with manslaughter. And also, for a short period, basically the person who's in charge of her in the police suggests that they haven't got a right to sack her. Now, that isn't true. and Geiger actually is later fired from her job in the Dallas Police Department. Now, when they do an internal investigation, it's an internal affairs investigation, they do sum up, and rightly so, that she was engaged in adverse conduct. That's the quote, engaged in adverse conduct. Again, understandably, as I've said, there is an enraged reaction in the local and wider community because people feel that this woman is literally up for manslaughter when she walked into somebody's home and shot them. Like, she made an active choice. But following the investigation, a grand jury actually do indict her for murder. That's in November 2018. So the murder trial, it begins September 2019. Now, the defence go for the claim that it's a tragic accident, and of course this tragic accident had ended in the life of an innocent man being taken. They said that Guyger was very exhausted, that she had obviously worked really hard in the police, she'd made an incredibly poor choice after being tired from a very long shift, and that genuine mistake means that she isn't guilty of murder. And I think that that would be a defence that any attorney would wish to put forward because it plays on the emotions of the jury. Listen, this is something that happened. It was a terrible error of judgment. She's very, very sorry. And by the way, I do believe that she was very, very sorry. But nonetheless, this is how you would play it. And you would also argue that she was an exhausted police officer trying to protect and serve the community. And it's just this terrible, terrible sliding door moments, this worst case scenario playing out in reality. And actually, if she could take it all back, she would. And going down that line, I believe, is a common sense fight for the attorney. But it's not going to be that simple. So first of all, some of the accounts that Geiger gives, they don't add up. So she gives this testimony that I went through before, and actually it doesn't match some of the physical evidence from the crime scene. And that's a big problem because you don't want to be in a court of law. Remember, she has said that Botham Jean had been standing and walking towards her at a fast pace, remember, saying, hey, 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 in an aggressive tone. But when the forensic scientist who specialises in firearms looks at the trajectory of the fatal bullet, they were able to indicate that Botham had actually been bent over. So it was likely that he was rising from the couch when shot. That would make perfect sense, wouldn't it? You hear somebody come into your apartment, you sat down, you're thinking, what on earth is happening? The first thing you're going to do is you're going to stand up.
I'll let you put this down.
So the autopsy had been very able to plot how the bullet had entered the body and the impact that it had. So the bullet basically entered just above the nipple and then travels down on this steep trajectory through the left lung, heart, diaphragm, stomach, and intestine. Yeah, it basically completely annihilates his internal important organs. So he was never ever going to survive this. And that bullet actually stopped in a muscle in the left abdomen near the spine. So this suggested that Geiger was either standing over Botham and shooting down, or that Botham was lying down or bent forward, so possibly, as noted, getting up from the couch or even ducking, because my God, you're going to try to, aren't you? You think somebody's walked into your apartment and is shooting, but bear in mind what I told you earlier, Geiger had claimed he was standing up straight and also moving towards her. Now, during the testimony, when she's questioned on this, she was basically unable to explain this inconsistency. And the problem is, if you are Geiger and you try to minimise what you've done, which again, it is a relatively normal human reaction to try to disassociate yourself from the level of guilt that you actually have, so you try to make the story sound less terrible, the idea of somebody running towards you, that would give you a sense of, oh, maybe there was a reason that she reacted this way. She genuinely did think that her life was under threat and he's running towards her and she shoots him. But that's not what the evidence is telling us. And the problem is, because she said that And then the jury are obviously going to listen to the reality that this guy was likely just getting up off the couch. Wow, that paints a different picture, doesn't it? So the prosecution, they have this evidence. So they clearly propose an alternative scenario, and with respect, one that makes sense. Should the prosecution say that Guyger hadn't been concentrating? You know, it's not that she was just tired, because bear in mind, the prosecution are going to paint her in the worst way possible. That's their job. They want to get a guilty verdict. And they are thinking of Botham Jean and his family. The reality is, like I said, we shouldn't be talking about this case. He was in his own home. But they want to paint a picture of somebody who is not just negligent, but negligent in a way that was choice-based, so that she had an option to be better, do better, act better. And she chose not to because of her own personal distractions. They say it wasn't because she was exhausted, it wasn't because she'd been on this really long shift, it wasn't that she was tired. She'd basically been very distracted by her texts and her calls with her police partner. Bear in mind, they also say, as far as they're concerned, even though they're suggesting their relationship had ended a year before, don't add up. They say, no way, she was having an affair with him. And you know, there is some incriminating evidence, guys, there really is. So first of all, they both deleted texts from their phones following the shooting. I mean, let's just be honest. Criminal 101, what do we know? If you have incriminating evidence on your phone, if you delete it, it makes you look way more guilty. Seriously, if you bang to rights anyway, you may as well just acknowledge the reality that your phone's going to be taken and they are going to look through it. And if you delete it, it ain't deleted at all. It's as simple as that. They can bring it back. So they, as the prosecution, are aware that both she and her police partner feel that they've got something to hide. Also, they say there's absolutely no way that Botham Jean had been aggressively walking towards her, and that when she entered the apartment, he was just sitting at home by himself on his couch, in his shorts, eating vanilla ice cream in his own living room. And that understandably, the minute he hears something, whether it's a noise as she enters, whether it's that she says anything, the reality is it makes him instinctively start to rise. And at this point, they say Geiger opened fire. Their argument is there was no warning at all. He literally was killed there and then. Now, the gunshot residue that was on the door frame, that did indicate that she'd fired from a distance in the doorway, which again, problematic, incriminating. If he's not close to you, there are lots of options for you. Is somebody going to run towards an individual who's literally stood there with a gun pointing at them and give them an opportunity to do it at close range? Highly unlikely. Also, there are some witness statements that again bring in a really problematic reality of what she's trying to say happened. So we've got 28-year-old Joshua Brown. He lives in the apartment that is literally across the hall from Botham. Now, he was walking down the corridor to his apartment at the same time that Geiger entered Botham's apartment. And he said that after he heard the gunshots, he sees Geiger emerge back into the hallway. She's crying. She's speaking on a mobile, saying that she'd gone into the wrong apartment. But what he crucially said he felt was completely at odds with what she says is that he didn't hear Geiger say, "Let me see your hands," or indeed anything else before the shots were fired. And you would know if you were literally in the same corridor. If somebody shouts loudly and then you hear gunshots, you're going to connect the two. But that's not how it played out as far as this particular resident heard it. Also, another resident, this person's only known as Bunny, they heard knocking on a door and also a female voice shouting, "Open up, let me in." And then this was followed shortly by a sound of gunshots. Then apparently they heard a man's voice saying, "Oh my God, why did you do that?" Now, it's also important for us to acknowledge that at the time of this shooting, Geiger had a taser and pepper spray strapped to her utility belt, but she chose to use lethal force. Again, I find it disturbing. She's entered an apartment that she didn't need to enter. She's killed somebody, but when they look at the ballistics, they can see that she killed somebody from a distance, and the reality and logistics of this is she had a taser on her that she could have completely incapacitated this person with. And that would be terrible anyway. Botham would still have been injured and unfairly, but we would be talking about a whole different scenario playing out. She chooses to use deadly force. Also, again, this is again incriminating. After shooting Botham, Geiger actually hadn't gone to his aid. So immediately when she's literally shot this poor guy, as opposed to thinking, oh my goodness, I need to make sure that he has a chance of life, she doesn't even call 911. The first thing that she did was send 2 texts to her partner. The first was at 10:02 p.m. It read, I need you, hurry, followed straight after by, I fucked up. Now, around 1 minute after hearing the shots, witness Bunny, they actually used the phone to record Geiger from the lower floor, because Geiger's pacing up and down, walking outside Botham's apartment, and she's crying and she's hysterical. And according to Bunny, what was really disconcerting for that particular witness is she didn't sound like she was on a phone call to the police at all. She didn't sound like she was speaking to 911. They felt that it was a personal call she made. And she definitely didn't see her administer any first aid to Botham. Bear in mind as well that when you take witness testimony, if there are witnesses whose actual statements are separate but collide, they kind of back each other up, and it does in this case because Joshua's account was a similar account regarding the fact that she was on a mobile phone hysterical, and they didn't believe that she was on the phone to 911 at that point. Now, from the 911 recording, we do know that Geiger was alongside Botham for the duration of that call. So that means that she must have sent the text to a partner and then called someone on a mobile before actually calling for help, before actually attempting first aid. So even though I'm sure that the injuries were fatal, the point is her job after a man being down in her situation by her own hands, she should have at least attempted life-saving measures.
This is Carla. Where's your emergency?
Hi, this is Officer the officer. I need Ina. I'm in number.
What's your address? Do you need police as well or just EMS?
Yes, I need both.
Okay, what's the address?
I'm at apartment number 1478. I'm in 1478.
And what's the address there?
It's 1210 South Lamar, 1478. Yes.
What's going on?
I'm an off-duty officer. I thought it was in my apartment, and I shot a guy thinking it was my apartment. He shot someone? Yes, I thought it was my apartment. I was fucked.
But the reality is that after she realises a mistake, she's speaking to other people and thinking about herself and how she's messed up, as opposed to thinking about Botham and getting him help. And bear in mind, every second counts in these scenarios. Now, when they cross-examine her, she actually admits that she'd never given any first aid or CPR to Botham. And that's despite the fact that she was trained. And she claimed that her mind was racing when she was on the phone to emergency services. But that's not what she said, is it? She said that she was attempting CPR with her left hand. So again, this is not good for a jury to see and hear. Because again, it means she's thinking about her own needs and not the needs of a man who's been basically executed in his own home. Also during the trial, another thing that really pissed off the prosecution, and I completely concur with as to why, is they actually brought up the fact that after Botham Jean had been murdered essentially in his own home, the police went and got a search warrant for his apartment. So this is after the shooting. And you know why they did that, don't you? It's about trying to discredit somebody's personality. As if whatever they got up to in their spare leisure time has anything to do with how the crime is played out. But it's that Can we annihilate this individual's personality and character? Can we make them to be seen as a really bad person so that somehow it's better that he was killed, or that it's not as bad that he was killed? That's why they did it. They went and got that search warrant to try to annihilate who he was as a human being. An innocent man had been killed, but the police decide that the best thing that they can do with this information is to search for drugs. Now, allegedly, they removed a small amount of marijuana. I mean, how the hell they thought that that was going to be helpful in this situation, or that would give any license for an individual to be able to have grievously bodily harmed and killed somebody, I have no idea. A really, really bad move. Bear in mind as well, by the way, Botham never been in trouble with the law before. I think what I talked about character-wise before, you would absolutely understand that there would not be a stain on his character at all. And actually, it turns out that the way that his character comes under scrutiny is when he gets shot in his own home by a police officer. The words insult to injury don't cut it, do they? The attorney for the family said, listen, we know why they did this. This is about trying to smear his good name, but it didn't work, because you can't smear somebody's good name when it's just good through and through. I find it incredible. I have said this before earlier on, but I'm going to repeat it. I find it incredible that Geiger didn't know that she parked on the wrong level. I feel it's even more incredible that she walked to her own door in a communal corridor, not realising that that was not her own door in a communal corridor. Not that the doormat was something that was there that she'd never seen before, and that didn't ring alarm bells that maybe she had got it wrong, or that the number on her apartment door was incorrect. Now, I agree to some degree. You could argue that she wasn't really noticing any of that because the door itself was slightly ajar, and that maybe that focused her attention. Arguably, though, I think in that moment, you've got time to really think, what's going on here? Why is my door ajar? This doesn't feel normal. I just kind of think there is a process that a lot of us humans go through in those moments. But the minute that she entered, you would expect that she'd realise that there was a mistake. I mean, surely, is it just me? Is it just me? It may not just be me. I don't think it is just me. But come on, listen. If I have a house that looks exactly the same as my house, the first thing I'm going to do when I open the door is I'm going to be like, oh, this doesn't smell right. It don't smell right. It doesn't feel right. There's something about this that does not feel familiar. You just know when you're in someone else's home. Again, I suppose you could argue that she had loads of adrenaline coursing through her veins and it was making her think chaotically. But I think if that's how you're feeling, maybe back away. Maybe that's not the mindset to pack a gun. Just throwing it out there. But for me, I have never met another human, unless they were highly inebriated. It does happen when people are under the influence. I do believe that's the case. I've actually worked on cases where people have been found in other people's homes in bed because they somehow managed to get in very drunk. They've not tried to do any harm. It's just one of those weird things when people are highly inebriated. I actually think part of it's laziness as well. I think it's just when you're that drunk, you don't care if there's a door open, you're going in and finding a couch. But for most of us, if you are compos mentis, you walk and you know straight away. Other people's homes, they feel naturally alien and foreign to us to an extent. Again, throwing it in there, it may have been dark. The same layout might have been there, so I appreciate that she would have some level of orientation. But even the sounds, etc., when you walk in are different. But I'll throw it in there just to be balanced. She could have been overcome with fear, but still, I'm struggling to understand how this happened. Unless somebody was resolute on thinking that they wanted an outcome. Because you know what? If you believe that you have an entitlement to act a certain way, and you find yourself in a situation where you think somebody has breached a boundary, and you believe that therefore you have the right to challenge them in a fatal way because they've dared to enter your apartment, And that mindset is such that you have a level of entitlement and arrogance associated with it. That is actually something that's compounded by what you do for a job. Then you may choose to ignore all protocol. You may choose to ignore all rational thought in that moment. And you may just choose to do something that you think you have a right to do because you're a police officer. Maybe it's something you're going to be able to talk about the next day when people are finding out that you took on a home invader and killed them. That worries me a little bit. I think that mindset exists in lots of people in authority. Not saying it does. Just for balance, I think it's important to look at the psychological context of these possibilities. Now, what I will also note is that the Texas Rangers who took over the investigation, they did conclude with respect that the apartment layout was confusing, and they did do a really quite thorough investigation to kind of find out whether this was a common feature of the experience of the residents. And they discovered that 93 of the residents had parked on the wrong floor on previous occasions, and 76% of those residents lived on the third or fourth floor. 23% of the residents who lived on the third and fourth floors had actually at some point put their key fob in the wrong door. In fact, 15% of the residents in the entire complex had done the same. And several residents actually did go on in court to testify about this, but the big thing that kind of reinforced they were doing something wrong was that they'd realised they'd made a mistake because the red blinking light on the door lock when they used the fob showed up. And that meant that they realised, oh, I can't get in. And then it was that, I'm in the wrong place. Also, differences in decor of corridor, wrong apartment number on the door was also something that kind of struck them. So even though they'd found themselves in that slightly disorientated state, it had been rectified relatively quickly. But it's important to bring that in, because it could be that Guyger had found herself in a very similar position. She'd only been there a few months, and the consequence was that she just didn't connect the dots. Now, according to Geiger, she actually genuinely says that she didn't notice the different decor, she didn't notice the door number, she didn't see the red blinking light because the door was already off the latch. And it did transpire that there was a structural flaw in the lock on Botham's door, and that meant that when it went to close, the latch didn't catch and close properly every time. So sometimes it caught, sometimes it didn't. And that, of course, is why we know that Geiger managed to open it fully with the incorrect fob, essentially, because it wasn't on the latch. Geiger has always maintained, she just made the most terrible fatal mistake. She said that at the time of the shooting, she was tired after a long shift, she was on autopilot, and she said that she feels absolutely distraught and terrible for what she'd done. She said that she wished it had been her who'd been killed and not Botham. And she repeatedly broke down during questioning in the proceedings, and they actually had to stop for a break. And I have watched some of the proceedings, and we always talk on this channel about individuals who have a level of culpability and recognise that culpability and show remorse, and who genuinely demonstrate honest to goodness, devastating emotions when they are in scenarios such as being tried for murder. I will say that I think Guyger is absolutely distraught. I really do. I do not think she's putting that on. I do think she's crying for herself as much as she's crying for Botham. I genuinely do. Her whole life has just fallen apart. She's lost a job. She's going to lose her freedom, and she is sat in a trial for murder. It would be massively overwhelming. She certainly isn't the kind of individual who is used to that kind of criminal experience, and it's not something that she could ever predicted. So I do genuinely believe there is a massive authenticity to the way that she feels. She cannot comprehend that she's there, what she's done to place her in that situation, and the consequences of what she's actually carried out, which is the murder of a man who was in his own home eating vanilla ice cream, just chilling. That must be overwhelming to process. And do I put her in the same context as the murderers that we talk about on this channel, who purposefully and willfully are predators? Absolutely not. But that does not mean she is not a murderer. And I think it's really hard for some people to get their heads around. She chose not to follow that police procedure. She'd shot an unarmed man in his own home with no lawful excuse. And as she had said herself right at the beginning, she had intended to kill him. And that meant she was guilty of murder. So then we get to the sentencing. Obviously, this is a stage where they decide how many years she is going to serve. The prosecution at this point submit texts, and they also submit social media posts of Geiger's, and they're actually arguing at this point that there are some racially offensive things that she's done, and they're trying to paint a picture of a police officer who's also racist. They suggested that she had anti-black or prejudiced perspectives. So in certain text messages, she was said to have allegedly mocked her black colleagues. Also, she apparently joked about Martin Luther Jr.'s death. And on top of that, she talked about getting a dog from a person who a friend told her may be racist. And Guyger had responded, "It's okay, I'm the same." Now, I cannot dissect what intention was there, because on the face of it, as far as I'm concerned, that suggests that she is racist. But I'm also going to say that I've seen a lot of bad jokes, and I've seen a lot of people say things in poor taste, in sarcasm. And even though you look at texts like that and messages like that, and if you read them cold, you think, wow, what bias is she carrying around in her head? And I think there's probable cause to say that she did have a bias in her head. But we also have to think about our own messages at home, when we're texting our friends, when we're texting our family. I always make a joke, and my sister makes a joke, that if my mum was found mysteriously dead, me and my sister would be sent to prison. Because the jokes that we make between each other are just so inappropriate. But it's just our really bad sense of humour. But if you were actually reading them cold in court, not using the intonation and language and sarcasm we use, they'd be like, we literally don't need any more evidence than their iPhones. So I am going to leverage a little and say that even though I feel they're racist, there could arguably some bad humour here. Not saying that's the case either, just for the sake of balance. Now, whilst on one level, it felt like there had been some justice, at least for Botham, I think that it makes perfect sense that a huge amount of people were really angered by the sentence that followed. I cover cases on this channel where people are in prison for 400 years, okay? There are literally people in the US prison system who were with somebody who got involved in the commission of a crime, and because they were with them, they ended up going to prison for life. And they weren't even involved. They were just somebody who was present. There are some stern sentences in the US of A, land of the free. The reality is they give big sentences. And this is murder. Murder. She's been found guilty of murder. So with the murder conviction, Guyger basically faced anywhere between 5 and 99 years in prison, which seems to be quite an extreme spectrum. You know, if you said to me, Emma, in 5 years, you'll be a millionaire, I'd be like, that seems like a really nice idea. I'm going to be able to enjoy at least the winter of my life in relative contentment and, shall we say, luxury. But if you said, Emma, you'll be a millionaire in 99 years, it doesn't really have the same impact. It's a massive difference, isn't there? One's going to really impact on your life. One is going to be marginally impactful. So 5 to 99 years, you're thinking, okay, where are we going to go within that? And understandably, you're going to expect something relatively stern. This is a police officer who killed a man in his own home and didn't need to. The jury ended up sentencing her to 10 years with the possibility of parole after 5 years. That's a really short sentence, you know? And we're talking about Botham Jean's life. We're talking about a man who was eating ice cream on his couch and he got shot and murdered by a police officer. But they're just my views. I'm not saying that everybody would agree with me. I'm sure some of you really empathise with her and feel that that's an appropriate sentence. I just have to say that I keep thinking about how I'd feel if it was my son, and I always think about personalising it because that's how I can empathise more readily with those who lose, and I certainly wouldn't feel satisfied. However, during sentencing, the family of Botham actually get to read victim impact statements, and I would test any of you to be able to watch Botham's younger brother, 18-year-old Brant, give his victim impact statement and not literally cry. My son cried, my husband cried, I have cried, and I've watched it several times, and it never stops because it is one of the most profoundly humbling, compassionate scenarios I think I've ever seen. So bear in mind, we're talking about Botham's brother, who's just lost his big brother, reading a statement about how his losses affected him. But all he concentrates on is forgiveness. He says he forgives Guyger. And if that isn't striking enough, and if it isn't representative of the kind of human being that Botham was and who created him, because clearly that compassion comes from a wider perspective of his experience being brought up in this amazing family. This 18-year-old young man, he asked permission from the judge to give Geiger a hug, and that hug's granted.
I don't want to say twice or for the 100th time what you've or how much you've taken from us. I think you know that. But I hope you go to God with all the guilt, all the bad things you may have done in the past. Each and every one of us may have done something that we're not supposed to do. If you truly are sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you. And I know if you go to God and ask Him, He will forgive you. And I don't think anyone could say it. Again, I'm speaking for myself, not even behalf of my family. But I love you just like anyone else. And I'm not gonna say I hope you rot and die just like my brother did, but I personally want the best for you. And I wasn't gonna ever say this in front of my family or anyone, but I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you. Because I know that's exactly what both of them would want you to do. And the best would be give your life to Christ. I'm not gonna say anything else. I think giving your life to Christ would be the best thing that both of them would want you to do. Again, I love you as a person. And I don't wish anything bad on you. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Please?
Yes.
Geiger was breaking her heart, and even the judge was emotional. And like I said, it is so humbling because most of us can only imagine bitterness, hostility, rage, and it's totally understandable at that point because your life has changed. A traumatic loss means your life is never going to be the same, and yet there is something so wholesome and something so authentic about the trust that Brant has in God and the trust that Brant has in how Botham would wish for Guyger to live her life. In fact, the fact that he doesn't even want her to go to prison is something that I find astonishing and beautiful. Bearing in mind as well that so many people are enraged by the sentence, and yet all you hear from his family is deep compassion, deep humility. Now, following the hearing, Judge Tammy Kemp, now this is a judge who's an African-American woman, she also went over and hugged Guyger and she gave her a copy of the Bible. Honestly, you know when you have those moments where you're like, sometimes love transcends everything, doesn't it? And we have this scenario where this police officer is going to prison and a lot of people are very, very angry. And yet in that room where she's been sentenced and the judge has delivered that sentence and the family are there sharing the news of that sentence, and all they want for Guyger is forgiveness and a belief that things can change and that she can grow. And like I said, I don't know whether I've got that in me, but it is unbelievably powerful to endure and experience that kind of reality. And I think for Guyger, it will have shifted and changed something within her. If she did have any of those prejudices in particular, I think they will have been absolutely eradicated immediately, because the absolute care and the willingness to forgive is something very, very deeply unusual. Now, this case is controversial enough. Of course it is. What I've talked about so far is harrowing, but it doesn't end there, because one of the key prosecution witnesses in the trial was later shot dead. So Joshua Brown, the guy who lived opposite Botham. Bear in mind, this is a guy who was very brave, so he'd agreed to testify in court after other people had refused. And we have to remember why, because it's scary going up against the police, isn't it? People feel that they're putting themselves potentially at risk. So he is willing to testify. Then a few months after the shooting, Joshua's basically just moved to an apartment. It's only 5 miles away. I can't blame him. Must have had some awful memories of what had happened, and he must have had loads of unwanted attention because obviously the press and media were massively, massively interested. But he'd also, it turns out, been shot and wounded the year before, and the shooter had never actually been caught. So he'd kind of been known and seen, and he obviously wanted to keep a low profile because he didn't want his life to be under threat. Less than a week after Guyger's conviction for murder, he's shot dead outside his complex. Now, the police actually found him in a car park and he had multiple gunshot wounds, and so he didn't make it very long. He was pronounced dead shortly after getting to the hospital. But during the search of his apartment, the police apparently found 5.4 kilograms of marijuana, 5 ounces of THC cartridges, and apparently $4,000 in cash. And what I'll say about witnesses is that they claim that a 4-door sedan was actually seen speeding away from the scene. And apparently they were able to pretty quickly identify the suspects. So in December 2019, 3 men were indicted by a grand jury on capital murder charges. Allegedly, they'd gone to meet Joshua. It was apparently about a drug deal, and then there'd been an argument, and then apparently Joshua shot one of them and wounded one of them. And then another guy who was in retaliation to this shoots Joshua twice and kills him. Apparently they also stole his backpack, they stole a gun, but I'll be honest with you, in my research, a lot of people very sceptical about the events. And according to the police, this is what they claim, they said that the 3 suspects had travelled 300 miles from Alexandria, Louisiana to buy drugs from Brown, which I don't know. I don't live in the States, but I live in the UK and I can get drugs on Snapchat if I want. I kid you not. My kids have shown me. They literally put out things like good pills, good Charlie, good Mandy, and you can just get in touch and they'll meet you on the corner. It's not hard is what I'm saying. I ain't going to be driving 300 anything to get drugs. Obviously, guys, I'm not getting drugs at all. I'm far too old and I'm exhausted just existing. The idea of doing anything that alters that consciousness makes me knackered just contemplating it. But I will say that Joshua's mother, she says as far as she is concerned, it didn't add up and there was more to it. And I also hate the fact that Joshua gets remembered in this negative way, where obviously there was a lot of pro-social attributes to him. And I think sometimes it's really easy to get brought down and bogged down by the reputational dissection of events afterwards. And certainly I think we should remember Joshua as somebody who was brave enough to give testimony against the police, essentially. Now, meanwhile, remember Bunny? So that was the neighbour of Botham's, and again, another key prosecution witness, and a black woman, so just bear that in mind as well. She had actually videoed, remember, Geiger immediately after the shooting. The amount of crap that that poor woman received is shameful. She was trolled, she received the most horrific racist abuse, she received death threats. And the reason for this is when she'd handed the video to the prosecutor's office, she then actually released that video on social media. And the point that people were angry about was that she'd chosen to release it. I don't know why. It was hers to release. And she didn't create something. She just recorded what was playing out. She got messages that were horrific. And those trolls, and you know what they're like. And I've said this before, if you're new to my channel and you don't know this, you want to read about the dark triad. Because believe me, a lot of trolls have the dark triad of personality traits. Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic. Nice trio. Nice trio. You want to block anybody who's a troll. Because they ain't sad people sat at home on their own. They're communities of really nasty humans. And wow, did they get together where Bunny was concerned? So they get in touch with her employer. Of course they do. It's what they do. It's not just about disagreeing or feeling upset with her perspective. No, they want to absolutely nuke her. They put messages all over her employer's Facebook page. Of course they do, because they want to cancel, they want to ruin her. They want to destroy her. And of course, when they're doing this, they're accusing her of being a radical anti-police and black extremist. So basically, they're suggesting that she's out there disrespecting the authorities and that she's a terrible human who hates white people, because that's the indication when you call somebody a black extremist. And it's absolute BS. But because they are so insistent, because they are so consistent in these attacks, she ends up getting fired from her pharmaceutical job because her employer basically didn't want to be associated with a high-profile case. What a coward. Seriously, what a coward. And it gets worse, guys, because they actually blacklisted her credentials, which she'd earned whilst working for them. That is disgraceful. That pharmacy should be taken to every employment tribunal ever and forced to pay out a lot of money. Bunny did not deserve that, because you know what she'd done? She decided to post that video, and I'll tell you why. She hadn't originally decided to do that, but in the days after the shooting, she saw reports that were coming out that contradicted what she had seen. The proof of the pudding was on the video, right? She hadn't got a big voice, but she wanted to make damn sure that these inconsistencies didn't become truth. Listen, that happens all the time. A lie is told and told and told again, and then people believe it. And she didn't want to do that. She wanted to be able to show people the truth. Botham was dead. He didn't have a voice. So she decided to be that voice. And this is what she got for it. Absolute racial abuse, death threats, and a loss of a job, which is criminal as far as I'm concerned. Now, Guyger, and again, I will tell you, I have sympathy and empathy with her. I know that she will massively regret her actions, there is no doubt. But she still deserves what she got. She definitely deserves to be incarcerated. And she's incarcerated at Mountain View Unit. It's a maximum security women's prison in Gatesville, Texas. I can imagine it won't be pleasant for somebody who is a police officer. I do not in any way underestimate the added problem, because understandably prisoners may not feel very positive towards you. They will see you as an entry route for why they are in the situation that they're in. And she has actually attempted to appeal her sentence and conviction. We understand that. It tends to be the case every single time. Although I think if you've got 10 years and you might be out in 5, why don't you shut up, do things quietly, get on with trying to survive, and maybe let the family just rest, because they've been through hell and don't really need any more added to their horrible traumatic experience. But she basically, in the appeal, argued that it was a genuine mistake, and that genuine mistake negated the culpability for the murder. So in November 2022, the US Supreme Court, they look at that and they declined to even review the case. They upheld the conviction and the sentence from the original trial. So she'll be eligible for parole actually in 2024. That will be next year from when this video is being recorded. Now, Botham's family, they've obviously been left with a huge Botham-shaped hole in their lives. I mean, this is a guy who was incredible. And they've actually filed a lawsuit against the city of Dallas and Geiger. That happened in late October 2018. Now, they claim in this lawsuit that lax training and poor city policy were the contributions to Botham's death. Now, the lawsuit was originally dismissed. I don't think there is room or license to dismiss this kind of case. But fortunately, a federal judge actually later reversed the decision, thank the Lord, and they allowed the family to actually submit an amended civil rights lawsuit. Now, that litigation is ongoing. They're also, understandably again, suing the apartment complex and the company that manufactured the tenants' key fobs. So their claim is that that locking mechanism on Botham's door was defective and dangerous, because it meant that it was nearly impossible for the door to properly close. And that meant that not only Geiger, but pretty much anyone could have entered his apartment uninvited. And so therefore they've got these suits going. And listen, we all know that money doesn't bring anybody back. Of course it doesn't. And no one's going to pretend that that's the case. But can we all agree that at the end of the day, money can at least give some level of acknowledgement that something happened that should never have happened? Personally, for me, that money's never going to make a huge difference to the psychological wellness of the family. They have to do that themselves through prayer and acceptance and forgiveness. And I think they're more capable of doing that than I ever would be. But it will at least afford them an easier life, and they'll probably be able to help others, which I think is a big part of who they are and who they've always been. And, you know, when it comes down to authorities, money is where it hurts. So I really wish them well in that way. Now, as I said, everyone will have different ideas. Supporters of Geiger, they feel really sorry for her. They say that, listen, she was just confused. At the end of the day, she was walking down that corridor thinking she was going into her own apartment, and she went in there genuinely believing that there was a man or a woman who was an intruder in her home, and therefore it wasn't murder. They say, as far as they're concerned, that mindset meant that she had reasonable cause to kill him. But you can't see it that way. Genuinely, you can't. I appreciate that people will feel conflicted in this case, because she's not a horrible human being. She's not somebody who's spent a criminal life doing awful things. She was an officer. doing probably her best in her work, and this horrible turn of events led to her now being a murderer. But let's just analyse and critique the reality. Botham was lawfully in his own apartment, where he should have been his absolute safest. If Guyger had reasonable cause to kill him due to her own stupid mistake, then when exactly wouldn't reasonable cause exist? Where's the line drawn between justified confusion and self-defense and murder? Ultimately, the jury had to convict Guyger because to be guilty of murder, you have to prove the guilty act and the guilty mind. The latter being the intent to kill or cause really serious injury. Guyger had freely admitted she fired at the silhouette of the person she felt was the intruder with the intention of killing him. She did the act and she meant to do it, even according to her. Her outrageous mistake about that situation was unreasonable. It provided no lawful justification. And furthermore, as an officer of the law, a trained one, she should have followed police procedure. And had she done so, Botham would still be alive today. It would have been an embarrassing situation where she'd have called for backup and then it would have all been realised that she was the one in the wrong and they'd have probably all had a giggle about it. But she chose not to do that. She chose to enter the apartment with the full intention of killing whoever was in there. She was trigger happy. And with respect, there definitely seems to be an issue with certain people in the States who are trigger happy. And we have to also be honest, in the States right now, there is a serious issue with police violence and brutality. Guyger's role was to protect the public and to serve the public. And yet her behaviour put the public in danger and caused the death of an innocent man. That all noted, what I would say is this tragic case is a very rare example of a police officer actually being convicted following a fatal shooting. She is in fact the first Dallas police officer to be convicted of a murder in 50 years. So, wow. And let's be honest, it's not going to be the only shooting that was very, very dubious. Now, following her son's death, Botham's mother, Alison, stated this: I need to look into her eyes and ask her why she did that to my son. She took away my heart. She took away my soul. She took away everything. He was in no wrong place at any wrong time. He was in his sanctuary, in the place where he called home. He didn't deserve this. And I think every single one of us listening to this right now agrees fully that he really didn't deserve this. I will fully understand if some of you feel that Guyger shouldn't have gone to prison for murder. I know a lot of people online feel that that was an inappropriate sentence. As I always say, the law is the law. Murder is very clear. She went in to fully intend to kill the individual in the home, and that individual was in their own home. You have to bring it back into the context of this. You're sat on a couch, eating vanilla ice cream, you're watching your Netflix box movie, and you're really just chilling. It's been a hard day at work. Suddenly, you hear a slight movement in the background, maybe a voice that you don't recognise. You start to rise from the couch in your own home. And then you're fatally injured in your own home by somebody who should never have been there. And your family have to pick up the pieces of that reality. They have to live with the tragedy of your passing and the knowledge of a life that should have been fully lived being stolen. And the person who walked in to your home, they say it's a mistake and they get to carry on with their life. And there's no punishment for your execution. If that was you, or if that was a member of your family, would it be so easy to say, it was just an understandable mistake and tragedy, she feels really bad about it? I don't think so. I think 99.9% of us would say an armed woman came into the home of someone I loved, shot them when they were just sitting watching TV, and they deserve, without a shadow of a doubt, to go to prison. And in this case, that's what happened to Guyger, and rightfully so in my opinion. She will get to walk the streets again. She will get parole. She will have a life likely fully lived in spite of this blight on her reputation. And that's more than Botham will ever get. And it's more than all the people who love him will ever get. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Let me know your feelings. Do you feel the same as me? Are you conflicted? Do you think she should have got longer? All of these things are absolutely justifiable. Your opinion is your opinion, and I appreciate and respect that, even when it's different to mine. Sorry for my appearance of this little dog who's crept out from behind me. That's what happens these days. She sits behind me the entire time, but sometimes she allows us to see her beautiful little face. She's gorgeous, isn't she? Molly, you're like my comfort blanket. See you again next time, guys. Like I said, let me know your thoughts. And if you've watched this, got to the end, and like the content, why don't you subscribe? I'll be here every Wednesday and Sunday. Ad infinitum, probably forever. Well, until, I can't do it anymore. Probably from the home that my kids will definitely have put me in. Be safe, guys. Take care.